Welcome everyone. So today, the ninth lecture in the class, the lecture for Monday, let's see, this would be Monday, June 15th, I suppose, right? So now we are officially halfway through the class, and we're almost complete with the Republic. So let's dive into today's lecture, right? Last time we talked about what justice is in Plato's Perfectly Good City. We finally got to see the definition of justice as it is in the city and as it is in the soul. And we got to see what is intrinsically good about justice, right? This idea that justice is some sort of internal harmony of the soul that infuses one's daily being in the world and all of one's activities in the world with a great deal of consistency and harmony in the soul, right? So it sounds like a really beautiful picture of justice. And at the end of Republic, Book 4, you may have seen that one of the things that Glaucon does is he feels as if the discussion is complete at this point, right? So let's go back to this part of the discussion here. Let's see, I should look at it like this. Should have had this drawn up at the beginning. Okay, here we go. So after he has articulated what justice is, right here, and in truth justice is, it seems, something of this sort, and he describes it as a sort of harmony of the soul, and then he says that virtue seems to be a kind of health or a fine condition and well-being of the soul. Virtue meaning the virtues of justice and all the other virtues combined in the soul. All of these seem to constitute a kind of health and well-being of the soul, making the soul a good soul, right? And thus also the person a good person. And then Socrates says something kind of interesting. He says, so now it remains, it seems, to inquire whether it is more profitable to act justly, live in a fine way, and be just, whether one is known to be so or not, or to act unjustly and be unjust, provided that one doesn't pay the penalty and become better as a result of punishment. What he's doing, in other words, is he's moving from the answer to the first stage of Thrasymachus's reformulation of Glaucon's argument. Remember where Glaucon gave the origin story of justice that comes out of the idea that human beings like doing injustice. They like getting things just for themselves individually, but they don't like losing out on that, so they come to a compromise, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. And that seems to put us in a better off position. Well, Socrates gives an alternative origin story, right? And that's what he gives us in the origin of the story. The origin of the city and the virtues of the city, right? And now in Republic Book 4, he's given us an explicit definition of justice, and he's also just now told us what is intrinsically good about justice. So now he needs to go on and answer the third stage of Glaucon's reformulation of Thrasymachus's view, which, as you may recall, the third stage was the idea that justice is the perfectly unjust life is better than the perfectly just life. So that's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to then complete the total response and to give an argument that the perfectly just life is actually better than the perfectly unjust life, given this new conception of justice that we have discovered. However, Glaucon says something interesting. He says, but Socrates, this inquiry looks ridiculous to me now that justice and injustice have been shown to be as we have described them. Even if one has every kind of food and drink, lots of money, and every sort of power to rule, life is thought to be not worth living when the body's nature is ruined from vice and injustice and make him acquire is ruined. So even if someone can do whatever he wishes, except what will free him from vice and injustice and make him acquire justice and virtue, how can it be worth living when his soul, the very thing by which he lives, is ruined and in turmoil? So Socrates says, yeah, it is pretty ridiculous, but he does want to try to complete the account against Glaucon's reformulation that Glaucon gave earlier, right? But something interrupts the completion of this account. And by the way, if you're interested in seeing the completion of this account, like what it is that shows the perfectly just life to be better than the perfectly unjust life, you have to look at Republic Books 8 and 9, where Socrates criticizes alternative forms of government, democracy included, in order to try to show that the form of life that's present in his utopia is actually better than any other form of life that's possible under any other form of constitution. But before they can get to that, he's interrupted at the beginning of Book 5, right? He says here, and this is where Socrates goes directly back to speaking to us for a minute, right? He says, I was going to enumerate them, that is to enumerate the points that he was going to make in showing the perfectly just life is better, and explain how I thought they developed out of one another, but Polemarchus, who was sitting a little farther away than Adeimantus, extended his hand and took hold of the latter's cloak by the shoulder from above. He drew Adeimantus towards him, while he himself leaned forward and said something to him. We overheard nothing of what he said except the words, shall we let it go, or what? Right? So Adeimantus and Polemarchus, Polemarchus, by the way, he's a character we haven't talked about. He is basically the son of the father whose house that they are having this conversation in. And so Polemarchus, this person who has sort of like a position of honor in the house, since it's actually his house they're having the conversation in, draws Adeimantus in and starts having a little conversation at the backside of the classroom, right? So Socrates, being a good teacher, stops and basically says, okay, but what are you guys talking about? What's the problem here, right? And what Adeimantus does is he articulates an objection that in the lecture notes that I've given you, the lecture outline that I've produced, I call this objection the engineering objection. And the engineering objection is actually quite simple, but there are some things that I want to say about it in order to show that its simplicity sort of covers over a great complexity or sophistication in the kind of objection that's being raised. So the engineering objection is basically this, right? If we can't show that the perfectly good utopia Socrates has just imagined is possible, then we really need not worry about trying to live in accordance with the values that inform this concept of the city. And this is because those things that we cannot do, we also cannot be held responsible for doing. So this is the way that I frame the first premise of this objection. It's the idea that if one cannot do something, then one is not obliged to do that thing. A quick way of summarizing this idea is basically the thought that ought implies can. So if you ought to do something, that implies that you can do this thing. By the way, this is an idea that was brought to prominence in philosophy as such, just this principle as such, by a philosopher named David Hume, who lived in the 18th century in England. So, over 1,000 years later than Socrates is thinking about this right now. But it's not uncommon, really, to find concepts that are articulated in Plato, at least indirectly and not directly named, also being picked up and articulated by later philosophers, perhaps to a different extent or in a different direction, right? But in any case, the key idea, I think, should be clear, right? Like if you are, say, walking to class, when we can walk to class again, say you're walking to class and you see someone who has become injured in the park or something, and say that you are in a, say that you are more than able to help this person out, right? Suppose that they're injured in such a way that if they don't get help immediately, they will die, right? And you're standing right there and you are perfectly capable of helping them out. There's nothing to prevent you from helping them out or from being able to actually aid them. In this situation, it looks like if you, it looks like there's this overriding assumption, right, or idea that we should help those people that we are able to help, and because we should help those people that we are able to help, and in this situation because you are able to help this person, then you would be doing something morally wrong if you were simply to shrug your shoulders and keep walking, right? You would be in some way morally liable for that person's death if they were to die because you didn't render them aid, right? Now contrast that situation with another one where, say, the person has become injured and there's really no way that you could help them, right? Say that they have, I don't know, fallen into a deep hole and you have no way of getting down into the hole to help them out. You have no rope or ladder. Suppose you have no cell phone and you're in the middle of the wilderness, right? In this situation, if you do not help this person, intuitively it seems like you're not to be held liable for their harm, right? It looks like there's really no overarching obligation for you to help them if it is indeed the case that you cannot help them, right? So here the idea is if you ought to do something, right, this implies that you can do it, and in those cases where you can't do it, the obligation to do something is lifted, right? So bring this back to the utopia, right? The key idea that's being put forward here is, okay, if we can't, in fact, live in a city of the sort that Socrates, has just described, then it looks as if we are no longer held liable for living in accordance with the principles that inform this concept of the city, right? It seems like we ought not, or we don't need to try to live in accordance with the principles of the city because we can't live in accordance with the principles of the city, right? So that's the key upshot of this entire argument, right? So since we cannot, according to this objection, live in the way that befits the imagined utopia, then we are not obligated to live in accordance with the ethical and political ideas articulated for the utopia. All right? So it seems like what we have here is something like in books 2 through 4 of the Republic, what Socrates has given us is a really beautiful idea of what the human city could be like, right? But it is in fact the case that the human city could never be that way. So all that he's given us is this imaginary world. It's kind of like a fairy tale. And we might think, oh, well, yeah, if life were like it is in this fairy tale, that would be really nice. And, we should certainly strive for that if that were possible. But guess what? It's just a fairy tale. So there's no way we can actually live up to it. So that means we can just consider Socrates' reflections to be something like a really nice story, but it doesn't really tell us anything about what the moral and ethical truth of the matter is. Okay, so that's where the objection first, that's how the objection is raised in this book. Now, the objection isn't given quite so flat-footedly by Adeimantus, right? It's suggested at, and Glaucon, and Socrates, I believe, recognizes how difficult this objection is going to be to answer, and I think that he recognizes full well the kind of logic of the objection that's being raised. But the way that Glaucon and Adeimantus present the objection is basically in 3 stages. There are sort of like 3 different practical challenges that Socrates needs to explain how to overcome before they'll be satisfied that the utopia that he has described is actually possible, and thus that the utopia that he's actually described sets forth moral or ethical ideals that we actually have to try to live up to, right? So the first stage of this objection comes at 451d through 457b, right? The formulation of the objection and its answer. And it basically concerns the practical problem of how to include women and children in the city, right? If you look carefully at the discussion that's been carried out in Republic Books 2 through 4, Socrates is talking primarily about a city that's full of men. He's talking about a city all of whose jobs, all of whose workers, rulers, and auxiliaries are men. And he's never considered the problem of how to include women and how to include children in this city. And obviously that's an issue, because if you don't have women, then you can't have kids. And if you don't have kids, then your city's going to have no future. Right? So it looks like this is a genuine practical challenge that needs to be addressed if we are to understand how the city is actually possible in a world like what we actually live in. The second stage of the objection concerns the production and raising of children. Like, how are we actually going to make children, and how are we actually going to raise them? And this also ties into the practical issues concerning the distribution of private property, and thus also the structure of families or households in the city. we talked a little bit about what the family and household structure and how the distribution of wealth works out in Republic Book 4, and basically details about that are filled in further in Republic Book 5. Finally, in stage 3 of the formulation of the objection, Glaucon sort of pointedly presses the question of how exactly are we going to take a human city, like the city of Athens in ancient Greece, and actually start it on the path towards something like Plato's Utopia, right? How are we going to do this? Are we going to go in and sort of like buy an island and bring a lot of kidnapped kids there and hope it's the right mix? Are we going to try to take over another city and establish it? Like, how do we actually bring this about? That's the objection of stage 3. Okay? And stage 3, the statement of this objection comes pretty quick, but the formulation of the response to stage 3 takes quite a while. And basically, the formulation of the response to stage 3 goes all the way through to the end of book 7. Right? Now, since we're only reading book 5 and the beginning of book 7, for our notes here I only said that for our purposes it goes through the end of book 5. But fortunately for our purposes, we do get the basic idea, right? Sort of like the kernel of Socrates' answer to this final question, even though we don't get the full articulation of the answer really until the end of book 7. So, okay. So, for my purposes today, I'm only going to talk about 2 of these objections, okay? I'm going to talk about the first one concerning the incorporation of women and children into this city, and I'm going to talk about the third one concerning how we actually start a city on the path to becoming something like the Utopia. I'll leave out of account the stuff concerning stage 2. However, there still may be a quiz question about that, so you want to be sure that you read those sections carefully. Another thing to notice is that the tail end of book 5, where Socrates is talking about what the philosopher is, how we identify a philosopher, that's something we'll talk about in the next lecture in relation to Republic Book 7. Okay? So let's dive into the first stage of the objection that's given in this text. Let's see. So the question primarily centers on this. How are we going to incorporate women into the ranks of citizens? Now, this is a particularly interesting question for this day and age that Socrates is living in, because, as I've said before, in this day and age, in order to be a citizen of Athens, you had to meet 2 criteria. First, you had to be a man, and second, you had to own land in the city of Athens. So if you weren't a male landowner, then you couldn't be a citizen, and you didn't have any sort of rights of a citizen in the city of Athens. The only way that you got something like civil rights in the city of Athens, if you were not a male landowner, is if you lived in the household of a male landowner. And then the rights and privileges that your male head of house gave to you, well, those were considered then your legal rights and privileges. So basically all legal rights and privileges for women and non-landowners and slaves were basically filtered through the male landowning citizens of the city-state. So what Socrates is doing here is considering something that's actually going to be considered quite progressive for his own day and age, right? Quite out of step with the traditional way of doing things in Athens, because he's going to be considering that the fact that women could be citizens, right, independently of male counterparts, independently of male heads of household. So Socrates considers this question more specifically in relation to the question of what is the function that women can play in the city? What's the job that they can have? Now, you might remember from the end of Republic Book 1, at least I hope you do, because this has been really central to a lot of the discussion we've been having thus far, that Socrates considers the function of a thing to be basically that which that thing can do better than anything else. So the function of a person in the context of a city will basically be that thing that that person can do better than most other people in the city. And so the question we're basically asking here is, okay, what is it that women can do better than anyone else? And is it the case that what women can do better than anyone else is altogether different from what any man can do better than anyone else? In other words, the question is basically this: can men and women have the same jobs in the city? Can they have the same function? Now, Socrates' answer to this question is very important. And it's important to recognize this right up front because you might not see it in the text if you're not careful. His answer is basically yes. Men and women can have the same function in the city. The nature of men and the nature of women are different. But he thinks they're not different enough to make it such that we can't also have women rulers, women auxiliaries, women doctors, women farmers, women tailors, and so on, right? For everything a man can do in terms of being a function in the city, he also believes women can do. So every job that a man can do in service to his society, so also a woman could do in service to her society. However, the way that Socrates argues for this point is in an indirect fashion. He doesn't just come out and give us reasons for believing that. Rather, what he does is he considers an argument for the contrary position. He first considers an argument for the claim that men and women cannot have the same jobs. And then he turns around and refutes that argument, right? In fact, the way that it's set up in the text is basically this. He considers what we might call a traditional Athenian perspective on this issue. He says, okay, what would your, given what, suppose that an Athenian person knew the contents of the discussion we've had thus far. Suppose that they knew that we think that justice in the city is basically where every citizen in the city does their own job that their nature fits them to do and doesn't meddle in the business of another. How might they use that against us in order to argue that men and women cannot have the same jobs? So he articulates that argument on behalf of his opponent before he then turns around and refutes this argument in order to show what the argument's flaws are, and thus in order to show that women can in fact have the same jobs as men. So the argument in, let's see, let me show you where in the text the argument comes up first. Okay, here it is. Yeah, so he first states sort of like the pointed idea of this argument, starting at around 453a. Right? So he says, shall we give the argument against ourselves then, on behalf of those who share these reservations, so that their side of the question doesn't fall by default? In other words, he's saying we should formulate the argument on behalf of our opponents, and we should formulate the argument in such a way that it's the strongest. That way, whenever we refute this argument, we'll know that we really will have refuted the best possible case against us, thus showing that our side of the issue is the better of the two. Right? So Glaucon agrees to this, where he says there's no reason not to. So he says, this is Socrates formulating his opponent's argument. He says, then let's say this on their behalf. Socrates and Glaucon, there's no need for others to argue with you, for you yourselves, when you began to found our city, agreed that each must do his own work in accordance with his nature. Can you deny that a woman is by nature very different from a man? And Glaucon says, of course not. And isn't it appropriate to assign different work to each in accordance with its nature? Certainly, Glaucon says. How is it then that you aren't mistaken and contradicting yourselves when you say that men and women must do the same things when their natures are so completely separate and distinct? Glaucon asks, do you have any defense against that attack? And Socrates says, it isn't easy to think of one on the spur of the moment. So I'll ask you to explain the argument on our side as well, whatever it is. So this argument that we've just read, right, from 453a to 453c, basically has an outline like this. The first basic premise is this: men have different natures from women. And if you look later on in the text, Socrates actually spells out the logic that he thinks your traditional Athenian person will have in mind whenever they are saying these kinds of things. And this actually comes up most explicitly. Yes, right here, starting at 455b. Okay, at 455b. So if you have a copy of these lecture notes, right, you might tag in here next to these 3 extra points that these come from 455b, right, a few Stephanus pages later. But basically what he says there at 455b is that here are some of the key differences between men and women. And remember, it's not clear that Socrates is saying this because he really believes it. I think that he's actually saying this because he believes that this is what his opponents will believe. And I think he wants to sort of grant the truth of these opposing claims just for the sake of argument, just so that he can show that even if we grant these opposing claims, even if we grant these extra claims alongside the first premise of the argument, it still ultimately won't help with his opponent's case, right? It's still the case that his argument is not that his opponent's argument is not altogether convincing. But in any case, here are the three key claims that he makes at 455b. He says, okay, women are physically weaker than men. He also suggests that Athenians in his own day will believe that women are not as smart as men, right? And this, of course, is a deeply misogynistic assumption, which I myself do not believe by any means. But it was a common assumption in Greek culture in the day. And then the final difference in nature is that women bear children, right? They get pregnant and carry them around heroically for 9 months before giving birth to them, right? Whereas men don't do that, right? So there are these 3 differences in the natures of the two kinds of human beings that Socrates says, okay, let's just grant these for the sake of argument on behalf of our opponent here. The second premise in the argument we've looked at says that in the utopia, one's nature determines one's function in the city, right? So basically, this is the concept of justice, right? What it is for a city to be just is for everyone to do that job that they are by nature fit to do. Finally, what follows from this, according to the argument, is the claim that men and women should have different functions or different jobs in the city, so that what men are fit to do, namely, as we have seen, to be rulers and auxiliaries and carpenters and so on, all of these are jobs that women are not fit to do, right? So women cannot be rulers in the city. They cannot have the same sort of class or level of citizenship in the city as men do. Right? They'll have to be a sort of second class kind of citizen, according to this argument. Now, as I said, Socrates charts this argument out not in order to endorse it, but in order to show us what is ultimately wrong with it. And Socrates refutes this claim by considering more carefully what the function of a guardian is, right? And in light of what the function of the guardian is, then determining more carefully what it is that we need to have in the nature of a being in order for this being to be able to be a guardian. So his argument is basically that women can be rulers, right? Because what we look for in a person in order to be a guardian is basically that they meet 2 criteria. These criteria are not easy to meet, but basically they're these 2. We look to see that they are physically stronger and more spirited than most other people in the city. And we look to see that they are intellectually smarter than most other people in the city. And Socrates claims, and where he does this is at 454 and 455, right? So the same place where he's saying, okay, look, the traditional Athenian's going to think that women are generally not as smart and not as strong as men. What he says at this point is basically this. Well, look, let's grant that generally women are not as smart and not as strong as men. Let's just grant that for right now. Does it follow from that then that every woman is weaker and dumber than every man? And Socrates here thinks that the answer has to be no, and the traditional Athenian will grant that that's not the case. He believes that even though generally the traditional Athenian will think, right, as a gross generalization, that men are stronger and smarter than women, he thinks that the traditional Athenian is not so blind that they won't be able to see that there are some women who are in fact stronger than many men, and that there are some women who are in fact smarter than many men. Now, what this means is that there could be a generation of children at some point in the city's um, future wherein the strongest and the smartest and the most patriotic person that's alive in the city is a woman, in which case we would have a woman ruler according to the laws of the city, right? So the idea is basically this, right? They have to cut a distinction that's more fine-grained than just thinking about things in terms of gross generalizations, right? So Socrates says, okay, fine. Let's grant that at the level of a gross generalization, men are stronger and smarter, right? And again, just to say, this is not something I agree with, even as a gross generalization, right? But it was a common assumption in ancient Athens. So Socrates says, okay, let's just grant this common assumption. Let's suppose that in general that's true. Does it follow from that that every woman is not as smart and not as strong as every man? And he thinks the obvious answer there is no. And since that's the case, that means that there could be these situations. Perhaps they will be extraordinarily rare. I don't know what Socrates would say about that, right? But maybe they will just be extraordinarily rare, wherein the smartest, the strongest, and the most patriotic person in the city would be a woman, in which case the woman would be a ruler. And he thinks that you can run a similar argument for every other occupation in the city, which requires a distinctive set of virtues, right? So the virtues and physical characteristics that are required for being a doctor. Maybe Socrates would say it is the case that we will ultimately have more male doctors than women, maybe because, women aren't as smart as men or something like that, right? But that doesn't mean that every doctor will be a man in every generation, because it could very well be the case that there's one generation that comes along where the person that is best fit to be a doctor is a woman. And ultimately what this means is that the fact of being a man or a woman really doesn't make any direct difference to which function you have. Right? It looks like being a man or a woman ultimately ends up being an aspect of the nature of human beings that's largely irrelevant to what function they take on in the city, right? Now it's interesting. I mean, what we get from this reflection, these set of reflections in the Republic, is something like an outline of what Plato would think unfair discrimination would look like, say, in the workplace, right? So Socrates seems to be, or Plato, the author of the text, seems to be committing himself to the idea that, look, if a person meets all the criteria for being a good practitioner of a certain craft, then whether that person is a male or a female doesn't matter. Indeed, even other aspects of this person's nature, say the color of their skin, their ethnic identity, their history, their income bracket, none of this really makes any direct difference to what job a person should have. All that should be considered is the person's nature, and in fact, and more specifically, those aspects of a person's nature that are directly relevant to qualifying them to be good at this particular kind of work, right? To consider anything else, right, that isn't really directly relevant to whether they're good or bad at this kind of work would be a kind of unfair discrimination on the part of the person choosing an employee, say, right? Okay. So that's basically how he argues for the claim that women can be rulers in the city, right? He thinks that the difference in the nature between men and women, there are differences, he thinks, but these differences are not significant enough to disqualify women from ever being rulers, or ever being guardians, or ever having any other job that a man has been said he could do in the city. Okay, so there's a certain kind of equality between men and women in terms of being workers in the city and thus also citizens in the city that's present in Socrates' Utopia that might remind us quite a bit of the kind of ideals for gender equality that we strive for today, right? Where we try to give people jobs based on their capacities and not based on, say, the color of their skin or their family heritage or their gender, right? Okay. Um, all right. So let's go to the third and final stage of argument in the text that's considered here. Remember, there's also this second stage that intervenes between the first and the third concerning how exactly we are going to produce children, right? Like how we're going to handle marriage and the structure of private households and distribution of private property. I'm just going to skip over that because I think while it's interesting and we can learn quite a bit from it, it's not something that I think is really worth our while over against these other two stages and what we can get out of those, given our brief amount of time that we have together to reflect on this text. So the third stage of objection, you may recall, is basically this more direct kind of challenge by Glaucon, in which he asks Socrates directly, okay, exactly how do you think we're going to bring this city about? So let's take a look at Stephanus page 471c. I'm pretty sure that it's Glaucon that asked this. It might be Adeimantus, actually. But we'll see. Let's go to 471c. No, it is Glaucon. I was right. Yeah, so basically, he's describing the kind of view of the city that Socrates has analyzed thus far. But he says right here, he says, take it that I agree that all these things would happen, as well as innumerable others, if this kind of constitution came into being, and say no more on that subject, but rather let's now try to convince ourselves that it's possible, and how it is possible, and let the rest go, right? So Glaucon's basically saying this, okay, fine. Let's just grant that we've hammered out all the details about exactly how the workings of this city are going to be. But we still have not answered this question. How are we actually going to bring these kinds of things into existence, right? We've imagined the details of the plan. Now, how exactly do we execute the plan and actually bring it about, right? Socrates is pretty surprised that Glaucon even wants to talk about this. And the reason that Socrates is surprised is because he didn't really think that that was what was the issue, right? What Socrates thought was going on was that we were going to be considering something like an ideal model of the city, right? Regardless of whether it can be possible or not. And then from this ideal model of the city, we were going to discern within it the virtues, right? The things that make it a good city. And then from there, we will be able to discern what the true virtues of human society are. But remember, now we're facing this engineering objection, which says that, well, look, we can't just rest easy with the idea that we can imagine this. We also have to see that it is in some way possible. Because if we can imagine it, but it's not possible, then this means that we doesn't look like we really have to try to live up to it, right? Because we ought to do those things. We only ought to do those things that we actually can do, right? And if we can't do it, then it looks like we need not really try. We're no longer obligated to live in accordance with these principles that are impossible for us to satisfy or to achieve. And so Socrates, he basically sort of reiterates this point that I didn't think this is what we were talking about. He said, then then it was in order to have a model that we were trying to discover what justice itself is like and what the completely just man would be like if he came into being, and what kind of man he'd be if he did, and likewise with regard to injustice and the most unjust man. We thought that by looking at how their relationship to happiness is opposite seemed to us, we'd also be compelled to agree about ourselves as well, that the one who was most like them would have a portion of happiness most like theirs. But we weren't trying to discover these things in order to prove that it's possible for them to come into being, right? So he's reiterating this point that I just made. Like, I didn't think that was the topic. And he even goes on to say that even if someone painted a beautiful picture of a human being, and that was actually the most beautiful human being ever, if we then showed that this most beautiful human being was impossible to bring about, we wouldn't thereby think that the portrait itself was in some way deficient, or that the painter was somehow not a very good painter because of this failure, right? It's sort of like that's just not what the painter was aiming for. They weren't painting something realistic, they were painting something that is the ideal, right? That's what Socrates took himself to be doing. So basically, what Socrates is suggesting here is that one way to answer the engineering objection that we articulated at the beginning of the notes, like right up here, is basically to deny this premise, right? The idea that if one cannot do something, then one is no longer obligated to do it, right? He's basically suggesting, well, why should we think that's true? I think that's probably false, right? And you can see perhaps why he would say this, right? Because there are many things in human life that are perhaps impossible to achieve. But just because they're impossible to achieve doesn't mean that we can just let ourselves off the hook with regard to them. For example, I suppose that an ideal of contemporary human morality is to eliminate hunger and homelessness. But it very well might be the case that somewhere on the face of the earth, at any given moment in the future, there are going to be people who are food insecure and who are homeless. So we might wonder, well, if we can't actually eliminate hunger and homelessness, does this mean that we can just give up trying, that we don't really need to try to eliminate hunger and homelessness? Intuitively, the answer to that is no, right? Intuitively, the answer is, well, even if it's impossible, it's still an ideal that we should strive for. And it seems like that's what Socrates is suggesting under this way of responding that I just outlined, right? That look, whenever we're doing ethics, we're not considering what's possible. We're considering, strictly speaking, what is optimal, what is the ideal. And we're setting up for ourselves goals that we might never achieve, but because they are the optimal, because they are the ideal, they are in and of themselves things we ought to strive for, right? So that's one way to see what's going on in these kinds of reflections. I mean, it rejects the principle of ought implies can, right? But to appease Glaucon and to further the discussion, it looks like Socrates makes a concession, right? So he agrees to a sort of compromise with Glaucon that comes up at 472e through 473c. Basically, in these passages, right, Socrates says that he says, okay, look, agree with me on these points, and I'll go along with you and try to show you that it's possible. He says, agree that first, that nothing can be done in reality as perfectly as it is imagined in theory, right? So we can come up with an ideal theory, and let's just agree right up front that our ideal theories will never come to be exactly as we have theorized them, right? Our plans will always come up short in some way whenever we try to realize them. So he says, grant me that much. With that, Socrates then says, okay, then let's take as our goal not to show that the perfectly good city can come about precisely as we have described it in the foregoing discussion, but rather that something really close to the city that we've described in the foregoing can be brought about, right? In other words, he's saying, let's say that my goal now is to show that we can bring about something that closely approximates the utopia that we described in books 2 through 4, right? Not exactly a replica, but something that's close, right? By the way, what we get here is something really interesting. It's actually one of the first places that pops up in the text where we get a kind of initial glimmering of some key parts of Plato's own view of reality, his own metaphysics, which we'll talk about in the next class, where we talk about Plato's theory of forms. But I wrote a little bit about it here in the lecture notes, but we'll talk about it in greater detail in the next lecture. So what is Socrates' answer? What is the smallest possible change that we can make to the city, a city like Athens, or maybe even a city like New York City, right? Any democracy. What could we do in order to put a city on the path to becoming something that closely approximates Socrates' utopia? Well, his answer is quite controversial, and it's one that sort of scandalizes his listeners, his interlocutors in this dialogue. Basically, he says the smallest possible change we could make to a democracy like Athens in order to set it on the path to the utopia, or something that approximates the utopia, is to make a philosopher king, to make sure that those that rule in the city are all true philosophers. If we can do that, then we'll set it on the path to the utopia. And really, there's no other way that it can be done, Socrates alleges. So here's what he writes. This is at 473c through e. Until philosophers rule as kings, or those who are now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, while the many natures who at present pursue either one exclusively are forcibly prevented from doing so, cities will have no rest from evils, Glaucon, nor, I think, will the human race. And until this happens, the constitution we've been describing in theory will never be born to the fullest extent possible, or see the light of the sun. It's because I saw how very paradoxical this statement would be that I hesitated to make it for so long, for it's hard to face up to the fact that there can be no happiness, either public or private, in any other city, right? Than if we did this, right? Than if we made a philosopher king. And of course this is controversial because of the way that philosophers were seen in Athens in this day, right? Socrates was seen as someone who was not really, who was very resistant to the authorities, very resistant and critical of traditional ways of thinking and of doing things in Athens. And so he was not really seen as fit as a ruler of Athens. And then you might think about the sophists who engage in the kinds of political reflections like what Thrasymachus does, right? And that might make you really nervous to set up someone like him as the king or the trainer of kings, right? So what Socrates has to do now in order to try to convince his listeners that this is actually the right answer, that in order to bring the utopia about, we have to make a philosopher king. What he feels like he has to do is he has to explain what a philosopher is. In other words, he thinks a lot of the worries that we have about the legitimacy and correctness of this answer derive from a misunderstanding of what philosophy is, and thus also of what the philosopher is. So that's what he does in Republic Books 5, 6, and 7, right? So in Republic Book 5, 6, and 7, he focuses on the nature of philosophy, of what philosophy is, and the nature of the philosopher, what the philosopher is. And as we'll see in Republic Book 7 in particular, he focuses squarely on the question of how we can actually produce a philosopher. What kind of training will we need to add to the education system in our city in order to produce philosophers and thus kings, right? So we'll talk about that issue in the next lecture, right? What is a philosopher and how do we actually bring one about? Then the next lecture we'll take a look at some text that comes up at the end of Republic Book 5, and then we'll spend some time reflecting on the kind of training regimen that Socrates suggests for philosophers in Republic Book 7. Okay. Well, I hope that this lecture was helpful to you, and I will see you, I will gladly see you very soon.